Joining us with her take today is PIMCO's head of U.S. public policy, Libby Cantrill. Libby, great to have you. I still think about how you described the race a few weeks ago, calling it a knife fight in a phone booth. And I wonder, has any poll done anything to move you off of that thought?
No, and nice to be with you, Carl. No, this is it. That's exactly it. I mean, it's an apt metaphor, maybe too graphic, but really this is going to be an incredibly close race, at least if polls are correct. We also remind our clients that while there was some pretty significant polling error that favored President Trump in 2016 and 2020, similarly, pollsters actually underestimated Obama's support in 2012. So polling error is symmetric, but if the polls are more accurate than not, this is going to be an incredibly close race. Will be decided at the margins, meaning that any marginal event that happens over the next 2 weeks could actually have an outsized impact on the election result.
Do you go along with this idea that the market, as Druckenmiller said the other day, may be pricing in a Trump victory if you look at cyclicals, small caps, Bitcoin, some of these Republican basket instruments?
Yeah, fortunately, we have the benefit of not having to trade the election because, of course, we're long-term investors here at PIMCO. But, yeah, I mean, the market does seem to be pricing in maybe a little bit of this Trump bump, if you will. However, how we're guiding our clients, Carl, is that this is it's too close to call to have really any high conviction either way. We basically put this as a coin toss at this point, and no polling over the last several days or several weeks have sort of changed that calculus.
What about in terms of the deficit and the candidates' plans and their impact on the deficit, and how that's kind of trickling down into a potential risk premium in treasuries right now?
Yeah, so, I mean, I laugh because actually neither candidate has really talked about the deficit, or at least very seriously. In fact, the initial conditions for the deficit are very high. I think this is maybe something people don't really appreciate. We are looking at 6.5% deficits as a percentage of GDP, regardless of who wins. And that, of course, is before any policy changes. It's before the extension of the Trump tax cuts. We think it's either a partial or full extension of the Trump tax cuts, or any new spending. So deficits are likely to increase. We kind of, are glibly saying that deficits are the biggest loser in November, regardless of which candidate wins. And to your point, that's exactly right. We think that as a result, the term premium, that premium that investors require to own longer-term bonds at the end of the yield curve, is likely to reassert itself. You see a little bit of this. It's basically the normalization of the yield curve, and we would expect, again, that to happen regardless of who wins.
Libby, you spent a lot of your time, I think, in this last note, and I think it's a good service you're doing here. We've been trying to do it as well, reminding people we're most likely not going to know the outcome of this election, certainly not on election night, as perhaps we've grown accustomed to through the years. I mean, what is your expectation in terms of how many days it could be if it does remain as close? Not to mention the possibility that Trump, if he were the loser, will contest the election for perhaps weeks in terms of the electors being certified and on from there.
Yeah, so I think, again, if history is a guide here, it is very likely that we will not know on election night. And if this election is as close as polls suggest it is, we are likely not to know potentially for days. And that's because this election could come down to Pennsylvania. I know you all have talked about how critical Pennsylvania is. It is the most important of all of the swing states. And if it does come down just to that state, again, possible, then we likely won't know until Friday or Saturday. And that's just because if we see the sort of same surge of mail-in voting that we saw in 2020, at least, Pennsylvania is very slow to count those ballots. They actually can't start even processing those ballots until Election Day. Again, kind of getting into the nuances here, but it is quite important for investors. It means that we probably won't know, certainly the night of the election, but potentially even the day after. The other thing I just would point out here is that we may actually not know the control of the House either. This is something that maybe is less reported, but because California, the majority may go through these California swing districts in the House of Representatives, California is actually quite slow to count as well. And so that just means that there will be this sort of prolonged uncertainty. Doesn't mean that anything nefarious is going on. It just means that sort of the wheels of democracy are working, albeit relatively slowly. So we think that markets really do need to be aware of this. And again, understand that uncertainty is probably the more certain outcome here, at least those days after the election.